Thank you for joining online today at Cornerstone Christian Church. If you're watching on social media or our YouTube channel and you would like to also access other elements of our Sunday services, including children's and youth activities, communion, and adult Sunday school, contact the church office by phone or email and ask to be included in our email list. Also, if you wish to give from home today, go to our website, www.cornerstonerock.org, and click on the online giving link. Again, thanks for joining us online today. We hope to see you in person soon.
When I first started out in ministry, I was single. Now, this led to some very interesting, funny, and sometimes awkward conversations. There was one time when I was interviewing at a church, and the senior minister was talking with me, and he asked me a few questions, and I think I gave some good answers. And he said to me, well, we really like everything that we're hearing. Would you mind sending us a picture of you and your lovely bride before we continue this process? We were on the phone. And I said, well, I can send you a picture of me, but I don't have a bride. And this is what he asked me. He said, why? Why? How do I answer the question, why are you single? Now, I think a lot of people sometimes ask single people this question and not realizing how actually deep a question that is, how a really loaded question that is. How do I answer him? What answer can I give him that's going to satisfy him? Because obviously he was expecting me to be married as someone who was in ministry, but I wasn't. So I've already crushed his expectations. Should I have told him that I just had a bad dating life in college? Should I tell him that some girl broke my heart and I just didn't really think about marriage right now? Should I tell him that maybe my parents had a bad relationship and I just didn't think I had a good enough example of marriage in my life that I could follow? Could I tell him maybe that I had just had too many sisters when I was growing up and the thought of living with one more girl just did not sound appealing? No, because none of those things were true. So I gave him my pat answer that I always gave people when they would ask me, why are you single? And I said, well, marriage is kind of a big deal, and it's kind of a one-time thing. And if I don't get it right on the first try, that's kind of a problem for me. So I'm really waiting until I make sure I can do it right on the first try. I didn't get the job, and that's okay. But I knew going into ministry that my relationship status was going to hinder me in some ways. That the expectation of me being married going in was going to be something that I'd have to combat as I continued on. But I didn't want to wait. I didn't want to wait for that. I wanted to serve God now. Today in our passage, Paul has some very specific things to say about waiting and about how we should serve God. Today we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 17 through 24. Out of the English Standard Version, it reads, "Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God." Tim talked to me a few months ago, back in January, about preaching this sermon. Obviously, a lot has changed since then. And I never would have imagined that we would be where we are today if you had asked me back in January, what would things be like when you preached this sermon? I could not have even begun to think about it. But that's also what makes this so interesting, because Paul is telling people to live as they were called. Now, that's a really hard question to answer right now, isn't it? It's one of those things where we're kind of asking ourselves quite a bit, saying, okay, how do I do that? Am I supposed to live as I was called in this situation where I'm stuck at home? to where I have to sit around and watch Netflix all day and go to Zoom meetings and not see my family and not see my friends and try not to gain too much weight? Is that the life that I'm called to? Is that how I'm supposed to be living, Paul? Well, obviously no. But to answer that question, we do need to go back a little bit in the passage. Tim, a few weeks ago, talked about chapter 7, the beginning of it. The last 2 weeks, he spoke ahead a little bit on chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians so we could coincide with Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. But now we're back on track, and we're back to chapter 7. If you want to go back to March 29th and watch Tim's sermon from that day, you can do a little bit of review. Don't worry, I'll still be here when you get back. Did you do it? Okay, let's move on. Back in chapter 7, verse 1, which I knew you heard, I'm sure that you've heard Tim already say these things, but what Paul says in chapter 7, verse 1, "Now concerning the matter about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." Now remember that all of 7 and 8 actually refer back to this single question. Now that might seem kind of strange because they're talking about living as we were called. What does how do men and women relate to each other have to do with living as you were called? Well, first off, Paul goes into marriage and he talks about its function and its purpose and how married people are supposed to relate to each other in Christianity. However, verse 17 actually connects back to this question by dealing with a general sense of life circumstances. Being married is one part of being alive. It is one life circumstance. But then he goes in and talks about 2 other life circumstances. Specifically, here he talks about circumcision versus uncircumcision, and servanthood versus freedom. Now, what do these have to do with one another? One is religious practices, and the other is economics. Basically, what he's saying is there are 4 main social statuses of all people in this world at this time: Jew versus Gentile, and free versus slave. Now, you might be thinking that sounds a little familiar, and you would be right. Paul actually uses this exact combination in Galatians. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, it says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Do you see? Uncircumcised versus circumcised, Gentile versus Jew, free versus slave. It even goes back to verse 1 in chapter 7, where he talks about male and female. He also goes into this in much more detail in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 22, but you can look that up on your own. By talking about these 4 social positions, Paul is quickly covering everybody in the church and saying it doesn't matter what place you find yourself in society. It doesn't matter at all. What matters is that you serve God where you are at. Doesn't matter if you're circumcised. If you're circumcised, then go witness to Jews. If you're uncircumcised, go witness to Gentiles. If you are a slave, witness to your master and your fellow slaves. If you're a master, witness to your slaves and to all those around you. Don't think that one position is better than the other. All are equal before God because God has called you in your position to go and serve Him right here, right now. Now, Paul does give one caveat. What he says is this in verse 21. "But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity." Now, at first glance, this might seem like a contradiction. However, if you go back to verse 7, he says, "I wish that you were all as I myself am," meaning being single. Paul expands on this later on in verse 32. What he says is, "I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord." He later concludes in verse 35 saying, "I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord." The advice to gain freedom is the same as his encouragement to remain single, that you can focus on serving God. If marriage can divide your attention, how much more if you're a bondservant? So what's the principle? The principle here is that whatever stage of life you are in, use that time to serve God. Don't wait for the right circumstances in order to serve God. Those right circumstances will never come. Too many people assume that the best time to serve God is later. Maybe when their kids have graduated high school, or they're retired, or they have a better job, or they've paid off their debts, or they get a new car, or they have kids, or they don't have kids, or whatever it may be. There's always some little thing that they're waiting for in order to find the right time to serve God. And the answer is that the right time never comes, because the right time is now. It's not later, it is now. One of my favorite books by Dr. Seuss, Oh, the Places You'll Go, actually talks about this. If you've read this book, it's one of the best books out there. I'm sure you've probably heard it read at different graduations. People quote it a lot of times. But one part that gets left out, I think, is the part called The Waiting Place. The main character, which is whoever's reading the book, gets scared, lost, and then he says this: "You'll wind up, I fear, in the most useless place, the waiting place. For people just waiting for a train to go, or a bus to come, or a plane to go, or the mail to come, or the rain to go, or the phone to ring, or the snow to snow, or waiting around for a yes or no, or waiting for their hair to grow. Everyone is just waiting for the fish to bite, or waiting for a wind to fly a kite, or waiting around for Friday night, or waiting perhaps for their Uncle Jake, or a pot to boil, or a better break, or a string of pearls, or a pair of pants, or a wig with curls, or another chance. Everyone is just waiting." Waiting can become a horrible cycle. We can always wait for the next best thing. This doesn't just apply in our faith. So many areas of our life, we end up always waiting for the next thing instead of going out and doing. But especially in our faith, we cannot wait for the most ideal time. We must go and serve God now. Had I waited when I graduated college for the right time to go into ministry, I never would have gone. If I had waited for the perfect ministry instead of going to a small church in a small town that was willing to take on a young, arrogant, untested minister right out of Bible college and show him a lot of grace and patience, I never would have been able to learn to be a minister in the real world. I never would have been able to become the person that I am. And had I not gone to that church and learned how to be a minister, I would not have been able to perform the wedding of an old friend from high school. And had I not performed that wedding for that friend in high school, I wouldn't have reconnected with his sister who I'd been friends with. And if I hadn't reconnected with his sister whom I'd been friends with, we wouldn't have started dating. And if we hadn't started dating, we wouldn't have gotten married. See, some people might look at this passage and think, Paul's saying that I can never change. I have to stay in the same place. God called me to this thing, and I'm always got to stay there because I'm supposed to live as I was called. No, that's not what he's saying at all. Paul is not saying stay put, never change. What he is saying is don't wait for a change to serve God. Serve God now. So how do we apply that today? Many of us are stuck in our homes. We don't get to go many places. We don't get to see many people. What do we do? Well, I'm actually very happy to say that many of you don't need this advice. I see day after day so many of you going out and living as you were called right now. I can't get on social media without seeing people from this church posting encouraging words, Bible verses, Bible studies, telling people to look to God, encouraging people to follow God. I see people talking about things that they're doing at home to help other people, even though they can't even go to other people's homes. I see people sewing masks, taking food, driving by people's houses and giving them encouragement. I see people who have taken upon themselves in the midst of so much negativity to just try and make people laugh. Seems to be their only goal. By the way, thank you so much, those of you who are doing that. I have laughed quite a bit by the things that you post. One of the most amazing things is I recently found out that a group of our high school students have been meeting every night since the lockdown began. They get on Zoom and they meet together to do a Bible study. I did not encourage them to do this. I did not suggest that they do this. They did this completely on their own. And as a youth minister, I am so proud to hear that, though I was a little disappointed that I wasn't invited. I pray that this time ends soon. I pray that God will bring us out of this time and that we will be able to get together right next to each other and encourage each other once again face to face. But at the same time, I am so glad that I get to see God working in people's lives right now, and people are not waiting. Maybe you are waiting. Maybe you haven't started yet. Don't wait anymore. Live now as God has called you. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Maybe he's not calling you to anything amazing. Maybe it's simply just to go out there to the people in your house and talk to them about your faith. Maybe they're already Christians, but you haven't discussed it with each other. Maybe you need to spend some time hearing from each other what you think about God. Maybe you need to take that time to maybe rekindle that relationship with your wife that God put in your life. Maybe you need to encourage your husband who's really worried about some things right now. Maybe you need to teach your children about God. They need to hear it from you instead of from a teacher. Maybe you need to spend some quiet time with God that you haven't spent in a really long time. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Live as you were called right now. God is calling you to service. It's your job to take him up on it.